Hi, and welcome to question 71 of chapter 1. So the question asks you to find the domain of each of the following functions. So let's get right to it. So for part A, the function is f of x is equal to the square root of x plus 2. Okay, so it's worth noting that um, anything under a radical cannot be less than 0 because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So you might as well set x plus 2 to be greater than or equal to 0 because that's the domain restriction for this function. What's under the radical has to be greater than or equal to 0. So after you set x plus 2 to be greater than or equal to 0, you can move the 2 to the other side by subtracting it. So you end up with x is greater than or equal to negative 2. And then if you want to write that in interval notation, you would obviously include the negative 2 because it's greater than or equal to negative 2. And it would go to infinity because anything greater than negative 2 as well. So this is how you would write the domain of this function in interval notation. Now moving on to B, f of x is equal to 1 over x minus 4. That might not be very clear, but 1 over x minus 4 plus 3. So to understand how to find the domain for this function, you need to know that the denominator cannot equal 0, or else the function will be undefined. So in this case, x minus 4 cannot equal 0. So let's just write that. Cannot be equal to 0. So x cannot be equal to 4. If you move the 4 to the other side, x cannot be equal to 4. So very simple. The domain is from negative infinity to 4, and then union 4 to infinity. So yep, it's all values besides the 4. X is defined for all values except for 4. So obviously from the negative, it goes from negative infinity to 4, undefined at 4, and then 4 to infinity. So that's your domain for part B. And then for part C over here, the function is f of x is equal to log of x minus 4. Okay, and so just to understand this function, you need to know that you cannot take the log of 0 or a negative number. So x minus 4 has to be greater than 0. Cannot be equal to 0, cannot be less than 0, because you cannot take the log of a negative number. That's really important. So once you know that x minus 4 is greater than 0, you know obviously that x is greater than 4 by adding 4 to both sides. So the domain must be from 4 to infinity. And notice that I put a parentheses around the 4, not a bracket, because the domain does not include 4. It's greater than 4, not greater than or equal to 4. So that is the domain for part C. And then for part D here, we have the function f of x is equal to the square root of 2 minus x over x. So you know that x cannot equal 0 because you cannot have a denominator of 0. And we also have the condition that 2 minus x over x, the whole fraction under the radical, has to be greater than or equal to 0. Because, again, you cannot take the radical of a negative number. So let's write those two restrictions down. X is not equal to 0. And 2 minus x over x, the fraction under the radical, is greater than or equal to 0. Okay? So you know that 2 minus x is greater than or equal to 0, right, by multiplying by x on both sides. And x is greater than or equal to 0. So 2 minus x is greater than or equal to 0, and x is greater than or equal to 0. Okay, and then you can subtract the 2 and then divide by -1, and you get x is smaller than or equal to 2, and x is greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so basically what you get from this information right here is that the domain is between 0 and 2, right? Because it's greater than or equal to 0, so you're going to include the 0 in the domain, and less than or equal to 2. So you're going to include the 2 as well. So you would write it like this, in interval notation. Domain is from 0 to 2. Sorry, that should be a bracket. Okay. Yep. And so I hope you learned from this video how to find the domain given a function. Thank you. Actually, I'd like to correct myself. You cannot include the 0 because x cannot be equal to 0. That was a silly mistake of me. So instead of a bracket here, this should be parentheses. So yeah, it's parentheses around the 0 and a bracket around the 2 because the 2 is in fact included. Okay.